On this episode of Newt's World, I think one of the most important things we have on our agenda as a country is to balance the federal budget and pay down the national debt. The national debt is nearly $37 trillion right now, and it's going up. I think we owe it to our children and grandchildren to balance the budget and bring fiscal responsibility back to the federal government. As Speaker of the House in the 1990s, I led the only effort in the last 100 years to balance the budget for 4 straight years. So I know it can be done because we did it. We were successful then, and we can be successful again if we do what it takes. My guest today is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, David Bahnsen, overseeing the management of $7 billion in client assets. Prior to launching the Bahnsen Group, he spent 8 years as a managing director at Morgan Stanley and 6 years as vice president at UBS. He is consistently named one of the top financial advisors in America by Barron's, Forbes, and the Financial Times. He is the editor of the Dividend Cafe newsletter. David, it's a great honor to have you with us, and given the scale of your knowledge, thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mr. Speaker.
Let's start with the Fed and then go to tariffs. What do you make of the whole argument right now about what the appropriate rate should be and what the chairman of the Fed is trying to accomplish?
Well, as I find is often the case these days, my views require a little nuance, and nuance is sort of out of style. Most people are expected to sort of emphatically be on one particular side or another. I believe, first of all, that there is no need for a central bank to set the price of money. I do believe in having a Fed, so I'm not in the camp that some of my friends are of no Fed whatsoever, but I don't believe we need the Fed to set interest rates. I believe they can serve as a lender of last resort that provides a sort of Hamiltonian function in the economy and avoid some of the things we were afraid of that happened at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And yet them setting an interest rate that banks will charge overnight to be a reference rate for how all money is priced throughout the economy is, I believe, very intrusive and unnecessary. But with that said, I am not going to win that argument anytime soon. And we do have a federal open market committee that sets the interest rate as a policy tool to affect monetary policy in this country, whether I like it or not. And I happen to believe all at once that A, the president is wrong to jawbone Chairman Powell about what the rate should be, and B, the chairman is wrong to not be cutting rates. I believe President Trump is right that the rate is too high and that it is unnecessarily restrictive. But then when he goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, well, the rate should be 1% or less because it would save us money, I simply can't accept that argument. So I think Chairman Powell has dug his heels in to avoid looking like he's giving in to the president, which I think is extremely unfortunate. But I believe that the rate right now is unnecessarily restrictive and should be coming down based on all the criteria that the central bank is given to affect monetary policy.
If you think about it for a minute, there are 2 parts to this. I mean, in terms of the huge amount that we're now paying in interest on the federal debt, that's really set in the long run, not by the Fed, but by the bondholders. I mean, the Fed could artificially lower the rate, but if people won't show up to buy the bonds, then the rate for the bonds has to go up in order to get enough people in the market. I mean, what am I missing?
Well, that is definitely true, but the problem is that it is heavily manipulated, influenced by the Fed, because first of all, the term structure of our debt is extremely short term. Much like a mortgage holder, when they get an interest-only loan that's really cheap for, like, let's say a 3-year period versus a 30-year fixed, and they can't really afford the house with the longer-term mortgage fix, so they go to the shorter term. Our government has done that for a long time. And most states do that in their municipal borrowings too. So we have a very short-term structure of the debt, shorter than ever, much shorter, by the way, than when Bob Rubin was Treasury Secretary and you were succeeding in balancing the budget in the 90s. I think that when the long-term rates were around 1.5%, 2% a few years ago, that Secretary Mnuchin had a chance to try to lock the debt, but he wasn't able to do it. And so there is a big influence of the short-term rate on the cost of borrowing. But then others will say, well, but still people have to show up to buy it. And if the United States became credit unworthy, then people wouldn't show up and it would bid the rates higher. That is theoretically true, but as the world's reserve currency and as the best house in a bad neighborhood, there is no scenario that we've ever experienced where nobody showed up to buy our debt. The buyers have changed. There's been periods of time where it was insurance companies, banks, retirees, investors. Other times where it's been sovereign countries, foreign investors. They own about 7 trillion of our 30 trillion of bond debt. And then, of course, after the financial crisis, the Fed themselves became a buyer, buying about 18% of our debt sits on the balance sheet of the Fed through what was called quantitative easing. Now, that's low compared to other countries. The Bank of Japan owns almost their entire bond market. Our central bank is a buyer, and private investors are a buyer. And so you're right that the rate will ultimately get set. But when it's a short-term rate and the Fed is setting the short-term cost of money, the Fed has incredible ability to manipulate that price of money.
I tend to agree with you that the inflation level does not justify the current interest rate set by the Fed. But as a practical matter, you get into this circular argument that on the one hand, you don't want the president making monetary policy political. On the other hand, if the Fed's doing something that weakens the entire economy, the leader of the country has some obligation to at least speak out. And how do you balance those two?
Well, it's tricky. There's a historical precedent that some of that effort was done privately. You were speaker at the time, as I recall, when Alan Greenspan famously spiked rates very violently, very dramatically in 1994 and surprised the heck out of markets. It actually is what put Orange County, California into bankruptcy because it caught them off sides with what they expected would be happening in their portfolio. And at the time, President Clinton didn't publicly jawbone Chairman Greenspan about it, but Vice President Gore had some very stern talks in private with the secretary. So I guess I'm appealing to my fondness for conservative norms here, that if there's going to be conversation, as Secretary Baker had with Paul Volcker, and as Nixon famously had with Arthur Burns, I prefer they be done privately and not out in the public eye to maintain our credibility in global markets. If the central bank loses some of that credibility, and I'm not suggesting it has 100% of it, but it has enough of it to keep financial markets in a certain realm of seriousness. And I think undermining that independence is just on the margin problematic.
I can't resist. You mentioned Greenspan. You may remember that about the time I left the speakership, Greenspan testified to the Senate that they were projecting that we would have paid off the national debt by 2009, and they had a working group trying to figure out how you manage the money supply if there's no debt. It's one of the prouder moments of my career, frankly.
Well, and along those lines, you'll recall that in the 2000 presidential debates between candidate Bush and candidate Gore, one of the questions was what they planned to do about all this surplus money. And think about that question being asked now.
That's exactly it. Although I'm trying to work with the two budget committees in the House and Senate to launch a serious effort to sort of do once again what we did in the 90s and balance the budget, which is a bigger job now. It doesn't strike me that they are likely to raise rates enough to push us into a recession next year, that they're somewhere between stability and very slight reduction.
Yeah, well, that is correct. If we were to tip into recession, it would not be driven by monetary policy. And what would happen is that they would then overcompensate as they always do, and the drunken peasant would fall off on the other side of the horse. This is the great argument against a highly interventionist Fed, is that they're constantly playing catch up. They go too tight too long, and then it makes them go too easy for too long. I don't believe they're going to be hiking rates at all. I think that they will end up cutting in the September meeting, particularly in the aftermath. Now, Chairman Powell has cover to sort of save face to cut now because of the jobs report that came out a few days ago. But ultimately, the problem here is that they are restrictive, and it isn't just the inflation level. There's a lot of people that have been programmed to believing that the Fed controls inflation, and the Fed can affect inflation. I'm a Milton Friedman guy through and through, that inflation is always and forever a monetary phenomena. But see, what he said, we always quote only half of what he said, that it is too much money. We forget chasing too few goods. And Ronald Reagan never gets the credit he deserves for killing inflation. We talk as if it were only Volcker spiking rates that did it in the 80s. The supply side revolution produced more goods and services that soaked up excess money supply. So what we need is very similar to what you were so successful with in the 90s in balancing the budget. It was not merely cost discipline, which of course is entirely lacking in the Congress now, but it was growth. We needed revenue. And that is both anti-inflationary and anti-debt. It is pro-growth.
I was part of the Merry Band in the 1970s with Jack Kemp and others trying to really win the debate over whether or not you could have a supply side solution, which at the time was considered radical until Reagan adopted it and then got it done. I'm a very big believer that you defeat inflation with more goods and services, not with more pain. But let me shift gears now. Probably the greatest Trump revolution so far has been breaking up the world trading system that had existed and beginning to replace it with a much more bilateral system that uses tariffs. But I think the story is not just about tariffs. He uses tariffs for the purpose of forcing negotiations, which often range way beyond tariffs, and get us into investments and sales and, all sorts of things. And it's based on a simple model in his head that we are the largest economy in the world, so you want to be here more than we want to be where you are, and therefore we can charge you a fair amount for you to be here. And so far, at least on the surface, it seems to have led to very dramatic changes. But what's your take on this whole tariff process?
I apologize in advance, Mr. Speaker, that this is an area where I do disagree. And I recognize the nuances. And what I will say about what the work Secretary Bahnsen has done and where I think the president stands that I'm excited for is if some of the byproduct of this effort is to open up new markets. In other words, I'm saying something sort of paradoxical. I will celebrate it if it creates more trade. But I do not believe that the notion of the president and the White House and politicians in Washington, D.C. sort of setting the rules of commerce is something that conservatives should celebrate. And the notion that we are a store and that they will set the prices of it, I think is a very anti-market notion. Now, I understand that to the extent some countries have charged higher tariffs and we want to fight for reciprocity, I've always believed that if a country wants to hurt its own importers and its own domestic consumers by charging higher tariffs, we don't hurt them by trying to reciprocate by hurting our own importers and our own consumers. But that at least has a ring to it, reciprocal charges. However, what we're really seeing here is a lot of non-reciprocity, moving the total rates higher, not lower. But the ideal tariff rate I'd love to see is every country charging each other zero. But to the extent that the net effect here is going to increase the total cost to American business, Best case right now, it looks like it's going to end up settling, assuming we do end up getting a deal with India and some of the holdout countries. Brazil looks to be the one that's going to be hardest. About 400 billion best case, and 600 billion I think is very realistic. And it disturbs me a little to hear us refer to that as us making that money, bringing that money in to our country. That is money that goes out of our businesses. And it is a cost to the economy. It is a cost that goes from the balance sheet of the private economy to the balance sheet of the governmental economy, which is a reduction in productivity. So I'm fearful, but cautiously optimistic that if we can get better markets opened and ultimately negotiate better deals, if total trade collapses, regardless of what happens with the trade deficit, if total trade drops, then capital flows will drop. And the basic algebra of this is that our total investment is equal to total savings, and total savings includes foreign capital. People want to put money in our country for a good reason. And if we lose some of that foreign capital on the margin, then I believe it will impact productivity, impact labor, and ultimately impact economic growth. So I recognize my opinion's a little outside the consensus right now.
But we wanted your opinion. You're here to provide your version of reality, and I respect that. One of the things which has surprised me is, and I first noticed it in Trump's swing through the Persian Gulf, he kept coming up with like $400 billion in purchases for Boeing, and then $400 billion of investments in the U.S. That was the Saudi version. And it was sort of matched by the other two countries he visited. He was coming home with almost $2 trillion in commitments. How do you measure the impact on the American economy of those kind of commitments?
Well, the commitments have no impact on the economy, but the actual activity will have a measurable impact. And that's where I hope I have the integrity and objectivity, because I'm not a flaming partisan who wants to criticize everything the president does, nor am I trying to say this is going to be the most messianic thing ever done. We will objectively be able to measure the success of some of these things by the two metrics I just said a moment ago, which is total trade and capital flows. Look, the optimistic version is exactly what you said, that they will order things that they weren't going to order before, and it will result in more FDI, foreign direct investment. And in case it isn't clear how big of a fan I am of Secretary Bahnsen, this is exactly what he's now been saying, which is categorically different than what Pete Navarro had been saying before. The agenda for tariffs had been sold as protective tariffs to try to boost domestic manufacturers. Secretary Bahnsen is talking the same way you just talked about, opening up new markets, getting new foreign orders. The problem is that there's a lot of ambiguity as to what it means. I'm not totally comfortable with those tweets where they will say the president alone is going to dictate how to direct this investment. I don't want President Trump or the ghost of President Reagan or President Obama or even Speaker Gingrich, for that matter, dictating what businesses are buying and selling from one another. But I love foreign capital coming into our country. SoftBank made a $500 billion pledge and created a consortium with others after the election, and they have so far spent $0. Now, I believe they will spend more. And I think a lot of the money is money that would not have been spent otherwise. So I will give credit where it's due, but I'm just trying to be politically honest that it's going to take time to see. And if there is some double counting, then we have to call that out. There is a lot of this that was going to happen anyways, but I want to measure it by the marginal addition to total investment.
You remind me in a sense of Reagan's appropriation of a Russian saying, trust but verify. Connie Mack once taught me, he'd been a bank president before he was a congressman. He'd gone to a course on running banks, and they taught him that you get what you inspect, not what you expect. And I think there's going to be a lot of inspecting here to see whether or not these nice press releases become real policy. But having said that, the other part of that in the One Big Beautiful Bill was this 100% expensing for new factories, as compared to, I think it was a 39.5 year depreciation. Isn't that kind of a staggering incentive to investment?
Oh, and it's not the only one. So you have the bonus depreciation on property put into productive use, and you have 100% business expensing for capital investment. So think of inventories, not just real estate put to work like building a factory, but machinery bought to put in a factory. And you also have a better deductibility for R&D, research and development, it's quote unquote soft CapEx, which is great for our pharmaceutical sector and technology sector. And you have greater deductibility of debt. Companies that borrow money had a limit in what they could deduct. And that helps a lot in the private equity space and middle markets. So there is some very pro-growth and supply-side parts in the corporate changes in the Big Beautiful Bill. The CBO scored that those things would be worth about $300 billion. Some could say $200 billion, some could say a little more. My point would be that the tariff cost is going to be higher than that. So I think that we have one side of the pool adding water and the other side of the pool leaking it out a little. I would have loved to have seen all those things in the Big Beautiful Bill happen without the offsetting cost of the tariffs. But those things are my favorite parts of the Big Beautiful Bill. And by the way, Speaker, because you and I are both here to talk about budget impact, those things do not add to the deficit. They are cleanly pro-growth that pay for themselves with added revenue.
It seems to me that the combination of this one Big Beautiful Bill and all of its various tax provisions and its regulatory provisions and the number of people making commitments to invest in the U.S., even if you only got half of those commitments, that there should be, by next summer, a fairly strong economy. But I'm curious, what's your view?
My view is that this is one of the hardest periods I've seen to forecast because of the push-pull factors that we're up against. I think the labor markets have weakened far more than we have realized. And the base effect is always a big factor when forecasting out 1 year of economic growth. What are you growing off of? And if you're growing off of strong momentum in labor markets, that's a wonderful tailwind. But if you're growing off of impairment in labor markets, then there's a headwind there. I think that there's been several months of uncertainty that has really not affected large multinational companies, so-called S&P 500 types. But I do think that there's some issues we're going to have to overcome at the small business level, which is where the vast majority of new hiring is taking place. Most job postings right now are companies with less than 50 employees. NFIB's data has not been great lately. So I'm an eternal optimist too. And yet, if I were trying to be objective about what the various factors are, if in a year from now economic growth has stayed muted, I believe that will be the reason that the small business side of the economy has been disproportionately impacted by tariffs. The larger companies that have access to capital markets, that have lobbyists and accountants and lawyers and exceptions and waivers, and also just the ability to plan better around it, they may not be affected as much. But I think the small business side I'm a little more worried about.
So you write the Dividend Cafe. Tell us about the Dividend Cafe.
Well, it's my weekly market commentary, an economic perspective. Anybody who reads it would be able to tell pretty quickly where I come from economically and politically and what my belief system is. But I really write it to try to provide objective advice for investors and economic actors. I began writing it in the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy in 2008. I was a managing director at Morgan Stanley at the time. And every single day, a new Wall Street firm was going under or merging or dealing with the drama. And I began writing into that time, and then I just never stopped. And so it's something we put out for free. Originally, I was doing it for our few hundred clients, but we're now managing over $8 billion. Hundreds of clients read it, but so do tens of thousands of non-clients. And so I just figure if it isn't broken, why fix it? And even though something of the drama level of financial crisis hasn't happened since, the news has kept me busy. I never find myself lacking a topic to write about every week.
I think when you take what's happening on the world market, you take what Trump is doing, you take the rise of artificial intelligence and other breakthroughs, the impact of modular nuclear in suddenly empowering all sorts of computer centers. The total scale of change we're going to go through, I think, is going to resemble the period 1870 to 1920. And having people like you who are smart, who are trying to wrestle with what is all this and what does it mean, I find really helpful for somebody like me to be able to sort of try to get inside your thinking and then, frankly, steal as much of it as I can.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I think that the optimism that we both share for a lot of these opportunities in the economy is real. And I will say, back to the subject of the balanced budget work that you did in the 90s, the internet happening at the same time that that level of fiscal responsibility had come in was a dual impact. We can't change the fact that right now there's a lot of things happening that are very opportunistic for forward growth, but they are going to be happening with an economy that's currently at 100% public debt to GDP and 123% total debt to GDP. And when you were speaker and President Clinton was president, over those 3 years of balanced budgets, we were running about 50% debt to GDP. So those ratios take away from future growth. We have sort of prepaid bonuses. And that is the problem, why it has to be solved sooner than later, because we're taking from our kids and grandkids what could be even better opportunities. I remain optimistic, but unfortunately, my optimism now has 100% debt to GDP to contend with.
I'm in a little bit of an argument with some of my fellow supply-siders who think, growth will solve everything. But the truth is, a Congress that's not under public pressure to get to a balanced budget will simply spend the additional revenue. And I don't think anybody's been able to make vivid enough the sheer amount of money we're now spending to pay interest on the debt. It's larger than the defense budget.
It's become larger than the defense budget. I think with what Big Beautiful Bill did to increase a little defense spending, that may go down a little. And if interest rates come down, then that debt interest cost may drop a little. But it's gotten to be very problematic. But the other factor that, if I remember correctly, at least in 99, when you had the second year of balanced budgets, I believe the mandatory spending was 30%, discretionary was 70%, and we've now turned that on its head. It's now 70-30 the other way. One of my other examples of a criticism with President Trump that, I'm sorry, we can't address this without entitlement reform. We can't and we won't. We will have to have grown-up conversations about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. There are solutions out there, but every year they've gotten to be harder. When the Democrats were demonizing Paul Ryan with the granny off a wheelchair nonsense, it was a much more fixable problem in what I believe was then 2010 or 2011, when President Obama appointed his own Simpson-Bowles Commission, which came out with a lot of sensible solutions. I did not agree with all of them, but I agreed with a handful. It was a much more fixable solution. Every year that goes by, it gets harder and harder. And the cliche about when you're in a ditch, stop digging, I wish somebody would listen to that.
Well, I think that from my side, I separate them out. I think Social Security can only be dealt with on a totally nonpartisan basis, which is different than bipartisan, and only when the American people have concluded that there's an improvement rather than a destruction. And that's a huge task, and is frankly the entitlement I would approach last for that reason. I just think it's very hard and very complicated. On the other hand, you may remember that part of our getting to a balanced budget, we invented Medicare Advantage in 1996 during a presidential campaign, and we had worked with people enough that, in fact, we were able to carry what normally would be Democratic groups in supporting what we were doing against Bill Clinton. And it's because they concluded that it was real and that we were serious. You can methodically change things. Now, one of the things I'd be curious about is, I thought what they did on Medicaid this time was reasonably responsible and defendable. Of course, it's demonized by the left, but that's okay. I mean, that's just part of the business.
Yeah. It's part of the business. I always wish we did a better job. You talked about winning the argument, which is what you guys did in the early innings of the supply side movement with Kemp in the late 70s. I wish that the Republicans would try harder to win the argument, because the Democrats have not just demonized, but they have bold-faced lied about what we've done with Medicaid. And what I've found to be effective with clients, with friends, with conversations of both left-leaning, centrist, and right-leaning people is when they talk about Medicaid cuts, I said, if I tell you that we were going to spend X this year and we're going to spend more than X next year, would you call that a cut? Nobody says yes. But somehow they've gotten away with saying we're cutting $1 trillion from something that we're increasing spending in every single year.
One of the great frustrations of my lifetime effort in the Republican Party is the willful refusal of Republicans to learn how to communicate. I mean, it's no accident that Reagan was a former Democrat, Phil Graham's a former Democrat, Donald Trump's a former Democrat. They communicate dramatically better than people who grew up inside the Republican Party. It's an amazing cultural phenomenon.
Well, it's so true. And I would even add, beyond the messaging and the marketing benefits and persuasive powers, but as a man of faith that it refuses to abandon my moral convictions, the welfare reform you passed in the mid-90s, I thought was most potent when it focused on not how it was more fair to all of us who were paying our bills, but how it was better for the humanity and dignity of the people. A workfare requirement was better for their souls, their dignity, their empowerment. It was a very Jack Kemp argument, as you know. This Medicaid issue, beyond the fact that it's unfair, and it veered under President Obama so dramatically from what the intent of Medicaid is. The reality is that it is unfair to these people to have their dignity taken away by basically giving another transfer payment to them, as opposed to a Medicaid that is truly there to help impoverished people. And I don't hear Republicans making this argument. I just don't, and we need to.
It's one of my great frustrations. Let me ask you, though, in a Fox News op-ed, you said, quote, New York City's shocking socialist victory is a dire warning for the right. And you framed Zohran Mamdani's victory as a warning for conservatives. Why do you think Mamdani won?
Well, on a political basis, the truth is that, one, because the opponent was terrible, and Governor Cuomo is attached to so much unlikability that he became a very weak candidate. We talk like name recognition is always a positive. I thought Hillary Clinton taught us that name recognition can be a negative too. So he wouldn't win if there weren't three opponents in the general. If he were running mano a mano against any one of the other three, whether it was Curtis or Eric Adams or Andrew Cuomo, he would lose, but he will likely win because the baby is split the other way. But how is he even in a position to win and even obtain a 40-45% plurality? Because his message sells when we accept the premise that populism is an acceptable way of communicating about the public good. That because something is popular, free bread, free groceries, government-run stores, the impracticality of these things, the unaffordability, the ineffectiveness, we can say all that all we want, but I believe that we have to reject any form of populism that acts like it is good public policy just because some people like it. And the AOCs of the left don't play by those rules. And my fear is that the right sometimes is trying to beat them by joining them. And I don't think we can do that.
We did a set of questions a couple months ago on the difference between socialism by itself and big government socialism. And it may surprise you, head-to-head, by 50 to 22, voters prefer capitalism over socialism. By 59 to 12, they prefer free market capitalism over big government socialism. So if you set the frame, he's not just a socialist, but he's a big government socialist. That term, because a lot of people vaguely see socialism as caring for the poor, being concerned, etc. I mean, it's important to remember, Bernie Sanders got 43% of the vote against Hillary.
That's right. And he would have got more if they hadn't rigged it against him in the Democratic Party. You know, I've been hearing for years, Mr. Speaker, that young people like socialism. And I've done so much analytics on this as an economist, and I will tell you that it just isn't true. But they do not like what they have been told capitalism is. This is the great moral duty we have in front of us post-financial crisis. A Randian secularist defense of markets will not sell, nor should it. A morally rooted defense of free markets that attacks cronyism. When young people think that capitalism means the power of government attached to big business, they're not going to like it, nor should they, because I don't like it. When we defend free enterprise, free exchange, mutual cooperation, division of labor, and an aspirational society, the language has changed a bit since Jack Kemp in the late 70s, but I was a very young person. I would read him. I would read you in the 90s. I would read my friend Larry Kudlow a little later. I found it inspiring. The moral defense of markets sells to young people.
And it's essentially a moral defense of freedom. The notion that we claim in the document we're going to celebrate the 250th birthday next year, we claim that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which, by the way, in the Scottish Enlightenment meant virtue and wisdom, did not mean getting drunk and hanging out on Miami Beach. But if you think about it, in order to have the right to pursue happiness, you have to have freedom.
This was the whole fusionist argument that came out of National Review in the 60s and 70s. And from Russell Kirk to Frank Meyer to Bill Buckley, you have to have freedom and you want to channel that freedom into virtuous activity. And it makes for a very good and fulfilling life.
Which, by the way, if you read Lincoln enough, you get exactly the same pattern. He understood it. He'd lived it. It was his own personal life. And he was passionate and willing to fight a 4-year war to defend it. I want to thank you. I always find it very invigorating to talk with you. You're very smart. You have very clear ideas and values. And we are going to let all of our listeners know that they can sign up to get the Dividend Cafe by visiting your website at thebahnsengroup.com/Dividend Cafe. And if you'd like to find out more about what David is doing, you can visit his personal website at bahnsen.com. This has been great fun. David, thank you very, very much.
It's been an honor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you to my guest, David Bahnsen. You can learn more about his company, the Bahnsen Group, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.